Welcome to the Alternative Leader podcast. My name is Mary Williams and I'm the Mind Architect. I'm also founder of the Alternative Leader Academy and author of It Begins With You. This podcast is dedicated to inspiring the leaders of today to lead with intention, both in their personal and their professional lives. My guests from across the world share their challenges, their knowledge and their experiences so that we can learn from these powerful insights to help us lead with strength, determination and compassion. Welcome to the Alternative Leader podcast. My name is Mary Williams and I'm the Mind Architect. My Alternative Leader guest today is Gavin Gallagher. Gavin's a property investor, an entrepreneur and a speaker. And he runs East Point Business Park in Dublin, in Ireland, which is a large corporate office campus that he runs with his family and has been running for the last 25 years. Gavin's career has been a real roller coaster ride with massive periods of huge success, but with periods of enormous challenge and disruption. It's led Gavin to start his own podcast to help others who are going through his situation, Behind the Facade, helping other young property investors look at what not to do, really, isn't it, Gavin?
Basically.
And you've had such a personal journey of resilience and challenge and adversity. And there are so many lessons, both on the kind of corporate property investment side, which I know you've sort of covered in other podcasts as well, but also on the personal journey of what it takes to run a business and run it successfully, but also kind of being a man and a family man and being involved in family businesses. So could you start talking us through your journey a little bit from the beginning?
Sure, Mary. Thanks for having me on. I guess to kind of start out on this journey, I kind of need to go back to the beginning. And my father, it kind of all began with my father was a businessman and property investor, entrepreneur. He was kind of an angel investor as well. And so he had quite a lot of things going on, but he also had suffered from poor health. And, primarily from an early alcoholism problem that he had, and he damaged his kidneys and liver and things like that. So he had suffered for several years with poor health. And at the age of 45, he went on a business trip to Africa. When he was in Africa, he got very, very ill. And they managed to stabilize him enough to get back to Dublin for medical treatment and things like that. But after about 3 months in hospital in Dublin, he died, and he was 45 years of age.
Gosh.
And I just turned 21. The day that he got sick was actually my birthday. So it was kind of a sad moment. And I was studying architecture, and I had planned on just becoming an architect and getting into that whole. I was a lover of drawing and designing and all of this kind of stuff, and that was my area of kind of passion, I suppose you could say. And suddenly I could see the stress and strain that my mother was under from, she was not a business person in any shape or form. She was basically just a housewife that was looking after the kids for her most of her life. And suddenly she's, trying to take over this business that my dad had been working in. And he didn't really talk much about the business. He just kind of got on with it, which is kind of a typical male thing, I suppose, that you kind of just get on with it and you just, you do what needs to be done. So suddenly my mom, I can remember, of course, you go through the period of mourning where you're kind of like missing, your husband and whatever. But she started opening his post and finding that he had millions in debt he was developing a property, and he had invested in a startup airline, and he had invested in a radio station. He was involved in a lot of these different startups, and they were all extremely risky businesses. And he had an overdraft of 60,000, and my mom opened this post to see 60,000. And this is back in the early 90s when interest rates were running at kind of 18% or 16%. And so it was panic stations. And so I watched my mom kind of go through this dreadful strain and stress. And I was mad keen to get involved in the running of the business because I was 21, but I kind of thought, I don't want to see her under the stress, so I'll take over. But she was adamant that that I finish my degree in architecture. So I stayed on. I had another 2 years to go, and I did that, but I just watched her basically go from being a happy housewife to being an extremely anxious person who was kind of in over her head. Every meeting that she went to, she had to make these big decisions and stuff, and it impacted her health. And so as soon as I got my degree, she basically handed over the reins and I got involved, and I had to fire a load of advisors that were taking advantage of us and things like that. So there was a lot of stuff. But what happened then was we started entering into this great period called the Celtic Tiger. And I was practicing as an architect, but I was also starting to fiddle, to dabble in the property market. And whatever it was about the property market, just everything that you touched at the time turned to gold. And I remember, buying a property for 25,000 and selling it for 125,000 within a couple of months, and this all happened to me when I was at this kind of young age, maybe in my mid-20s or something. And I'd always wanted to be kind of wealthy, and that had been kind of an identity that I had given myself as a young man. But funnily enough, I didn't connect business with becoming wealthy. I wanted to be the architect, but I also wanted to be wealthy.
Right, interesting.
I didn't have this kind of connection that you need to be a businessman to be wealthy. And suddenly I started making this money through these property transactions. And it kind of went to my head a little bit. So I started going in, making bigger bets and bigger bets and bigger bets. And just because of the timing, Irish property just went through this enormous growth curve, and things were growing at 25% a year. And I started borrowing money to go and buy things. And literally in the space of maybe 5 years, I amassed a fortune of maybe 10 or 20 million or something. Just it started to grow in an incredible rate. And it was extraordinary. And the problem is that I hadn't been given this kind of grounding in financial education or any kind of financial wisdom. I just was there like, wow, I'm making it now. And so of course I had to buy a nicer house because the architect came out and me. I wanted to design a special house. Did that. Then, I'd like to have a villa in Spain, bought that. I'd like to have a penthouse apartment in New York City, did that. I'd like to have a flashy car, did that. I'd like to have another flashy car, did that. And this kind of ridiculous spending spree went on. And now when I look back, I kind of just like shake my head and wonder like, what the hell was I thinking? But I didn't have anybody to kind of like basically tap me on the shoulder and say, you are being an idiot. So one of the reasons I've started my podcast is to try to educate people in that this is one of the challenges that you face when you get into the property business. It's actually quite easy to manipulate property transactions to feed a lifestyle that, and the problem is you don't pay the price early, you pay the price later. So the decisions you're making today will have a profound impact on you 4 or 5 years from now. But you'll have a great lifestyle between now and then.
Yes.
And then suddenly you have this, you have to pay the price. And that was something that I had no concept of. And so I just kept digging deeper and deeper. And I got to the point where, I mean, I was getting emails from these companies like, would you like to have a share in a private jet and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it was literally ridiculous. And I went on holiday with my kids to Disney World, and I bought like first class tickets for the kids as well as ourselves, and just, kind of like literally as soon as I had money, I had to throw it out the window. And because I thought that it was all going to keep on coming like that at this rate of growth as well. So at the rate of growth, I kind of figured it was just going to continue to go like that. Then 2008 came, and I had kind of created this persona that I was super successful business guy, property guy, and I had bought this property in Spain. I got a load of investors to put money in, borrowed 30 million from the banks, and piled into this property deal, and didn't actually really know much about the Spanish market. But of course, by that stage, my ego had taken over. And one of the things I talk about in my kind of podcast is the 3 E's, and that is the ego, your emotions, and the economy. Those are the 3 things that will sink a property investor's career. And 2 of them are things that you can control yourself, but one of them is one that you can't control. The economy you obviously can't control. And so anyway, I went down this spiral. Suddenly, the 2008 came along, and I had banks demanding repayments, and I had this and that. And I ended up being chased by 3 different banks for 16 million, more than I was worth.
Gosh.
Because all of the value of the properties had dramatically fallen in that period of time. So I went from being this hero who had, like, you know, this net worth of, you know, X millions, to suddenly being negative 16 million. And I can remember just thinking, like, how has it come to this? Like, how has it come to the point where, and then it progressively got worse, because you know, your figure, the net worth figure is very, very low, but you still have this income coming in from all these different properties. So I still could sustain kind of a certain lifestyle. But then as the banks started to force the sale of these properties at below market prices, suddenly your debt is remaining the same, but your properties that are paying the rent are disappearing. And I ended up in a situation where I ended up at one point, the banks decided to do a thing called a rental sweep, and they took every penny that I was earning off me. And so I had zero income around about, I think it was just January 2014. I hit kind of rock bottom in terms of financial situation, and I had no income coming in whatsoever. And I suddenly had to kind of figure out, okay, I gotta go and find myself a job. I gotta do this, I gotta do that. So it was a real period of stress and strain and hustle. I just had to, I was going out, you know, advising people here, there, everywhere, just anywhere I could bring money in. And so that whole journey has kind of taught me a whole lot of lessons and a whole lot of wisdom. And I kind of think to myself, I've watched a number of my family and relatives and stuff have taken their own lives because of stress and strain and depression that they were suffering from. And I at one point on my journey, I felt that I could identify with that strain that would push you over the edge. Now, I didn't think seriously about any kind of final outcome or something, but I remember appreciating the strain that they must have felt to actually think that this was a solution. And I thought to myself, I really don't want anyone else to go through that kind of thing. So I've started down this journey with the podcast and try to just come clean with people and be transparent about, you know, the highs and lows. I was enormously successful, but then I suffered this like enormous like downturn, and I don't mind sharing that. I kind of thought to myself, you know, I could conceal that, and I could kind of, you know, pretend that none of that ever happened, and you know, try to, but then again, it's the ego once again driving your decision making. It's kind of like, I don't want people, I don't want people to think bad of me, and therefore because I don't want people to think bad of me, I don't want to share these stories, but then nobody's going to learn from the wisdom, you know, the wisdom from the journey and the lessons. And so that's kind of where it came from. And that's where it's kind of begun. And I don't know, does that fill in some of the picture?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely fantastic. And actually, I love that you stopped on that point, because the fear of people judging me is absolutely huge, isn't it? And I think, you know, I know in sort of when I've heard you sort of speak before, when you've talked about that, when you started to lose it all, it was that kind of almost, I'm just going to ignore it because I'm this person. And actually, I don't want to be judged as this person who's a kind of a loser. And I remember hearing you telling the story of your shares. Was it your shares dropping down?
Yeah.
They were just dropping and dropping and dropping. And at each point, you're going, no, I'll be fine, I'll go back up. And actually, they just carried on dropping. And so I'm sort of very interested in looking at your journey. How much, I mean, you know, we say we can control the ego. We can and we can't, depending on the kind of the work that we've done and kind of how reflective we are about ourselves. But how much do you think, looking back, was ego caused the issue? Because you were very young. I mean, 21 to be launched into your father dying, which, you know, presumably came with its own grieving process, and having to, you know, become the man of the family, you know, look after all of your, you know, your siblings and your mother, and you're already doing a degree. I mean, the amount of pressure on that is phenomenal. So do you remember sort of how you felt emotionally at that time?
Well, I can remember, actually, it's funny you say that, because it's just triggered a memory that I actually had forgotten. But there was a point where it wasn't so much when my dad died, because I had my college kind of distraction, I suppose. But then 6 years later, what happened when my father died was he had been the chairman of the business, and his brother stepped into the role of chairman. And so we went through this period where I was kind of working under my uncle. My uncle was the chairman, but I was kind of like his I suppose, alternative director, I think is what the term was. And so I would sit in on board meetings, and it was a learning process. Now, there was a lot of decisions that my mother was taking and stuff, and I was kind of learning from those. But there was a period when it wasn't as stressful. Obviously, it was stressful for my mother, but for me, I was kind of more an observer. And what was stressful for me was watching her suffer and wanting to do something about it. So I started reading biographies and, business titans and all this to try to kind of really build my knowledge around becoming a business person and stuff. And that was what I was doing there. But what actually happened then, I started getting more involved in the business when my mother sort of handed over the reins to me. And I was young and inexperienced and wet behind the ears, I guess you could say. And so I kind of knew that. And so I stood back and I decided, I'm just going to listen and learn and kind of be sort of wise in that regard. And then we went away on a weekend retreat. We had just finished a big stage in this business park that I'm in now. And it was kind of a reward for everyone who had worked on the project. So we took them to this fancy hotel in the west of Ireland, and we everyone's accommodation was paid for, and it was lots of drink and lots of dinners and celebratory kind of meals and stuff. And we jumped on a plane then to fly back to Dublin after the weekend. And I said goodbye to my uncle, and he got into his car and drove to a hotel and hung himself. And that was total and absolute shock to all of us. We had absolutely no idea that there was any problem whatsoever. And suddenly this occurred. And that was extraordinarily stressful because, first of all, he had been kind of the guy that was leading the journey. And I was kind of sitting behind him. Suddenly I had to sort of jump into his role. Now, I didn't become chairman because I was way too young for that. Another cousin of mine stepped into that role, and I started working with my cousins. But they had prior to that, my uncle had all of the relations with these people. So it was a new role, and it was total learning curve, like from zero, suddenly all of this extra stuff. And I can remember going to my doctor and actually saying, I feel I can't sleep at night. I'm very, very stressed. Can you give me something? And I'd heard of Valium and these kind of things. And I remember saying, is there something you can give me? And he goes, Gavin, you're in your 20s. I said, I'm not prescribing you anything like that. What you need is a break. And he said, just go away for the weekend and take a break. So I kind of thought, okay, I'll do that. And so what I did was I went to a beautiful hotel in Ireland called Mount Juliet. And it's this like beautiful old period house set in kind of 1,000 acres of land. And it's all beautifully landscaped and stuff. And I spent a couple of days by myself, just completely relaxing, reflecting. I brought a couple of books with me, and I just read, and I just kind of wrote in a journal. And I started to kind of gather my thoughts, and just the pressure kind of came off. And I started to learn a few of the things that I really enjoy that kind of turn off this stress and strain. And one of them was exercise. I started to go running around this beautiful estate. And another thing was just drawing. I took out kind of a notebook, and I just started to draw pictures. And I can remember an hour or two would have passed while I was drawing this beautiful old house. And during that time, there was nothing in my mind except the drawing. And I can remember thinking to myself, wow, what a release from all of this stress and I had the best night's sleep ever after that night. And so it gradually, I started feeling better, and I started feeling and I went back to Dublin after, I think, maybe 3 days down there. And that was just a recharge I needed. And I didn't need anything after that, no Valium and stuff. But I started getting seriously into exercise at that stage. And I felt that the exercise really gave me this lift with endorphins and things like that. And then, so I got into the business. And so while I was going into working with my cousins, and I suddenly found that my knowledge around the whole property business was growing. And it was around that time that I started making all these, any decisions that the family business was doing, I started kind of saying, oh, I can do that myself. And I started mirroring what they were doing over in my own personal name. And so I started making all of this kind of money in my personal name while I was still involved in a family business. So I was juggling these two things. And I don't know, does that help with some of the
And so did you, and is this at the time when you were also married and having children and being a father as well?
This was just before we had my first daughter, and who turned 16 on the weekend, by the way. And so this is, I can time date a lot of this stuff to about 17 years ago and things like that. But I mean, I used to just basically look for more and more stress, I guess, in a sense, because I really wanted the success. And so I kind of, every time any opportunity to make money came along, I just jumped on it. It didn't matter what it was. I would just say yes. And it was, it worked because at the time it was this kind of crazy period when there was a lot of revaluing of Irish property, because the euro, it happened around the time that the Irish pound was replaced by the euro, and that drove this kind of crazy economic rise in property prices. And so I just happened to be in the right place. Literally, if you had given monkeys darts and told them to throw it at the board, you could have made money. And so I don't put it down to my, incredible wisdom and stuff. I was just in the right place at the right time. And I made all this, but my ego was telling me that I was this like genius and that I had this amazing ability to select perfect properties that were going to quadruple in value in the space of like 3 years or something like that.
Because they all would.
Because basically everything was doing that. And now I did have a couple of lucky breaks where I just bought stuff and suddenly somebody would come along and say, I'll pay you 2 million to, immediately after I bought the property, a guy wanted it and paid me 2.5 million, like premium.
And these sums are incredible, aren't they? Because for most of us on a kind of everyday basis, I'd like to be a millionaire is still the kind of dream, isn't it? What would you do with a million is kind of, your night out pub talk. Oh, I'd do this and this and this. And so to hear that you've had, millions and millions. And I remember there was a story that you were saying about how you were going on holiday and you went to the airport and you kind of went into the, the private room that the Tom Cruises would you use, and, you get driven up, was it in a Bentley to the airplane, and then you're, and it's, I guess I'm looking at the sort of clients I have and the kind of life experience most of us have. And that's the it's the dream, it's the movie, isn't it? It's the movie. And there were you in this movie, but as such a young man with no other kind of, you've lost your dad, who's the kind of the male influence. You've now lost your uncle, and it's just, to me, it's incredible that such a young man could go through those experiences. It almost sort of doesn't surprise me that it didn't work out, because where is the learning? Where is the growth? Where's the person to tell you, maybe you should save some or invest some, or, where is that person? Yeah. Do you think, looking back, do you think that your mindset was almost kind of the average young guy mindset?
I do. I see so much of it today, and this is what kind of drove me to start my podcast, because you just have to take out Instagram and flick through Instagram, and it's just nonstop BS. It's these guys that they have the private jet and they have the girls in bikinis and they have the Bentleys and the Lamborghinis, and it's every young kid's kind of dream is like, oh wow, private jet, pretty girls, fancy cars, lots of money, and they all think that this is the lifestyle that is achievable in the same way footballers do. We were saying before we went online, 60% of all Premiership stars end up bankrupt within 5 years of their career coming to an end. And then across the pond in America, 60% of all NBA basketball stars end up bankrupt within 5 years. And so, these are not unusual stories. You have this kind of massive success in a very, very short space of time, and you don't have the financial wisdom or education behind you, you will blow it, because you get into a lifestyle that is not sustainable. But the money coming in at the current moment allows that lifestyle to be maintained. But the moment your income stops, then you don't want to drop back to the lifestyle that you had before. You want to maintain this kind of champagne lifestyle. Yeah. And that's where it becomes extremely difficult to cope.
And it's interesting, isn't it? I'm sort of reflecting on all of the stories of people who win they win the lottery, and how it's gone in,
Bankrupt.
gone
Yeah.
in a year kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it is, we're lacking in sort of educating our children in money. I know, we were talking earlier about sort of teaching our children. You were saying that you kind of drive yours to school and teaching money lessons. And
the funny thing is they actually appreciate it. My daughters, they say, Dad, you're so cool. And I go, what do you mean? And he said, like, all of our friends say that they wish their mom, their dad would teach them business and financial stuff, like at a young age. He said, like, you're teaching us all this like business stuff, like going to school, and it's so cool. Like nobody else talks about this stuff. And the thing is I think they're actually hungry to learn this stuff.
Yes.
And since I started my podcast, I'm absolutely amazed by the number of young people writing to me. Like they're finding my email, or they're sending me messages through Instagram or whatever, and I'm getting messages from 17-year-olds saying, Gavin, I want to be a millionaire. I want to be a property guy and all this. And can you help me? Can you guide me? And I say, yeah, tune into the podcast, because I want them to see the full journey, the positives and the negatives. And I want to kind of teach them like that this stuff can come to an end very abruptly. And you need to put aside, your nest egg, and you need to prepare for this. And it means restraining. I talk about 6 R's, and one of them is restraint, and resilience is another. But it's all about, learning to be patient and disciplined, and don't look for the immediate gratification. Try to delay your gratification and give yourself small rewards along the way, maybe, but not this kind of like big fancy car the moment you can afford it, or the moment you can afford the payments on the car. You know what I mean? It's like you can't even afford the car, but you can afford the payments on the car.
It's interesting, just you say there about, that kind of delayed gratification. And we've talked a lot about boys and men. And of course, statistically, they say that boys are not so good with delayed gratification. Girls are, and that's why girls are great for studying for exams, because they recognise, this can be important. Whereas boys kind of the night before the exam go, oh my God, I've got an exam tomorrow.
Time, yeah.
Yeah, two years of information. Do you think, in personal opinion or otherwise, do you think it's more of a male problem? Actually, if you get a lot of money, this kind of ability to go, wow, I want all the trappings? Or do you think
that's a good question. I think it could be. It's, if the people that I know, that are a lot of men that I know, friends of mine that were living this similar journey, they all went down the road of, the bright colored Ferraris and all of this kind of stuff, and the really super fancy holidays where they're flying first class and all that. And there was this whole kind of keeping up with the Joneses and stuff. And I actually, racking my brain now, I don't know of a single female person, a friend that went through something similar, where they were like putting on this lifestyle. Now, of course, there would be wives of the husband, and they might be kind of, getting into the lavish lifestyle where they're buying handbags and things like that from the top shops. But in terms of somebody that actually earned it themselves, that had it like a successful business, I don't know of anyone. So I think it probably is a male-oriented kind of issue. Yeah.
Interesting. Could research a little bit of
yes, a little bit of
really.
Just my private circle. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Very interesting. So, but just to kind of take us back to those, you described them before as sort of dark moments when it all did start to come crashing down. You're a father, you've got this sort of profile, presumably out in the kind of corporate world. How did that affect you, just as a man, as a person, to kind of have that? Gosh, I'm going to lose all of this.
Yeah, it was very tough, and I was very much in denial for quite a period of time. I can remember. Like my marriage collapsed as a result of all of this strain, because I had banks calling me and I had this and that, and myself and my wife just suddenly started going through this period where we were arguing all the time, and I had made a couple of dumb decisions, and she would remind me of those decisions, and so that didn't help the relationship at all. But then on top of that, in order to try to bring income in, I started traveling abroad I started looking for work in places like Dubai and stuff.
Right.
And so I ended up spending weeks abroad, going, looking for work and working on projects and stuff. And while I was there, it was in this kind of denial as well. And I would, I'm walking around big building sites, and I'm the big guy who's still working on the big projects, and not, wanting to accept the reality that I had banks chasing me, and I had all of these problems building up behind me back in Ireland. And So there was a certain amount of denial, and there was just a lack of acceptance. And it wasn't until I described that moment when the bank came in and swept everything. Prior to that, I had these properties that were generating substantial kind of income. And the smart thing to do would have been to take an awful lot of that income and pay down debt and just carve off a small sliver and adjust my lifestyle accordingly. But I wanted the lifestyle. So I continued to fly around the world and travel and all this kind of stuff, living on all of that surplus income that these banks have been sort of allowing me to kind of live on. And suddenly a new bank manager came, a new relationship manager got involved. And he just said, right, that's it. The party's over. All of this is going. And suddenly to go from, having this surplus cash lying around, suddenly zero. And that was kind of a very, very abrupt wake-up call. And it was kind of like getting smashed in the face with a 4x4, And I just remember, like, suddenly it all came home to roost. And I remember kind of thinking, holy shit. So, like, being transparent, being fully transparent, what actually had to happen. I was living in London. I was living in a nice place in the kind of Victoria area, only a short walk from Victoria Station. And I came back to Ireland, and my brother had a house that he had bought when he lives in America now. So he had this house that was sitting there empty, and he said, you can live there rent free. And I needed rent-free accommodation for my brother in order to kind of survive. And that was the first kind of humiliation. And then, so I'd be like, at the age of 35, I had a 7-bedroom sort of mansion that cost millions. And here I am, nearly 10 years later, and I'm living in a 2-bedroom. My brother is letting me stay, and I have my 3 daughters sleeping in one bed in the spare room when they come to visit. And it was just this incredible downward spiral and this kind of humiliation. And I can remember just thinking to myself, like, what lies ahead of me here? Like, I mean, what kind of future do I have? I don't have the big deposit to put down on the next property that would actually help me get out of this, because the banks have just sold everything on me. And I don't have, I don't even have the income to actually pay for my kids to go to the school that I went to, because I can't afford that right now. So I remember this sort of dark moment when I kind of just thought to myself, my God, I can actually understand why my uncle would have taken his own life. I can actually, you're sort of staring down this dark sort of hole, and you see nothing at the other end of it. And so it was around that time that I just decided to kind of leave my alter ego, my past behind. And I said, you know what? I don't have to be the richest guy that I know, or the most successful. I can just be the fittest guy that I know. And so I kind of went 100% into just my health, and I basically started running marathons and doing all sorts of stuff, and getting into just really avid kind of fitness. And that is something that you can control, you can kind of manage every day. And it just built my resilience up, because suddenly you got this wash of endorphins through your system every morning, first thing. And so I got into a routine where I would I wake up early, and I sit at my kitchen table, and I would write in a journal, and I kind of map out a lot of my plans and my sort of objectives. And, I'd also write down, I had some dark thoughts yesterday, and I need to kind of like overcome that, and I need to put that behind me, and blah, blah. And then I would, I'd have a cup of tea, I'd be doing that. I'd do a little bit of meditation, maybe for 10 minutes, using one of the apps that you have on the phone. And then I'd hit the road, and I'd start running, and I'd, and just come back feeling fresh, and then able to kind of go out. And then the next thing that actually, and this is a weird thing to say, the next thing that helped me was actually another family tragedy. And one of my cousins who I worked with, or who I previously worked with and was kind of in business with my mother, he took his own life. And when he took his own life, my mother had a business partner that had been running the business, and I had to step in to basically help run the business now, because there was nobody there to run it. And so that actually suddenly gave me a salary that, and so it's this very mixed emotion where I'm facing this like dreadful situation, and suddenly my brother has given me his house to live in, and my uncle has just taken his own life, and I can now have the salary that and so it was a very unusual set of emotions. It was kind of relief in many respects, but at the same time grief and a kind of a sense of guilt, in a sense that, you know, I have got to make something out of this situation. I'm not going to go back to the same kind of crap that I did before. I'm not going to allow myself kind of get into that mindset where I feel like I have to do this and I have to show this and that. And I kind of thought, okay, I've got a story to tell here, and let's start to kind of
telling it,
to build that story. And so it's been kind of a slow but steady kind of journey since then, starting to rebuild and starting to kind of put the pieces together to kind of, and it's been but it has been challenging.
It's stunning though, because I actually, you know, I see a lot of male clients. You know, it's sort of 80% of the people I see, and they come in for very different reasons actually for the reasons that women come in, and often they've experienced, you know, suicidal thoughts. Occasionally they've tried it. And it's often down to that feeling that they failed as a father, or they failed as a husband, or they've just failed as a man. That's still very much embedded. You know, I know we've had sort of the Me Too movement, and we've had so much about women, you know, being lifted up, which, you know, obviously needs to happen. But there's, for me, a deep concern that men are not great at talking to their friends about their feelings. They're not good at reaching out for help. And sadly, I think I often see them at a point where, you know, if they'd come sort of 6 months earlier or even years earlier, and they wouldn't have got to that state. And recognizing that sort of mental health is, you know, if I've broken my leg and you know, I'm not feeling happy, it's a similar thing. But it's that pressure, and even having men, you know, whose wives have said, you know, you're not earning enough, you're not doing enough, you know, be a man, you know, step up and be a man, you know, it's that sort of thing. And it's such an awful pressure for men specifically, I think, to be under. You know, women have their own set of challenges which are equally serious but very different. And it's interesting how you talk about the kind of fast cars and the, you know, I have a lot of men come to me and they say, you know, I'm in my mid-40s, I'm kind of trapped in a marriage that I'm not that happy in anymore. You know, I've got teenage kids that I'm not really, you know, I don't really know much about them, because actually I've just been kind of working myself to the bone for the last 15 years. They're in private school, we've got this big house, you know, the dog, the cat, the pool kind of thing. I'm trapped. And I think when we talk about, you know, suicidal thoughts, and you've kind of, you know, you've brought this up too, it's people very rarely want to die. They very, very rarely want to die. What they want is to be out of the situation that they're in, and they can't see another way out. And so they end up taking their own life. And so I think, you know, it's that ability, isn't it, to see there is another way here, there is another life. I have my life, you know, even if I have to go and be a, you know, a dustbin man or a, you know, whatever it is I don't want to be, you know, it's fine. I just need to reroute it. So I love the fact that you took this mindset and kind of went, okay, you know, I'm kind of here at the bottom, you know, I'm having these thoughts, but, you know, I have three girls, and I have my life, and I'll start again. And that you invested it into exercise, because, you know, one of the first things when I get busy male clients especially is I say to them, what's your diet, what's your sleep, what's your exercise? And a lot of them will say, oh, well, I used to go to the gym, you know, 3-4 times a week, but I don't know, I'm so busy now. And I'll always say to them, you need to slow down to speed up again. Please put the gym back in. And I said, your brain will be so much more effective during the day. You'll pick up that hour that you've missed. And so I love the fact that was what you did, was embedded into exercise. But what's your sort of, if you could give people a sort of a learning, and especially men, of a learning around, you know, you are not all these trappings, you know, you're not the private school, and, you know, life will go on if these stop. How would you word it?
Well, the thing that, first of all, going back to what you said, there's this huge stigma around mental health in the male kind of population I see. And it's funny, I don't know any of my friends that would admit, I mean, maybe they are, but I don't know anyone that would admit to be having a therapist or something like that. And whereas in America, it seems like, you know, you hear people saying, oh, I have to go and see my shrink. And this is like on every TV show I ever see, it's talking about their shrink. I don't know anyone who has a shrink.
No.
And I don't know of anyone who would talk about it openly as well. It's kind of like the stigma around it. So that is probably the first thing, is that people seem to feel there's this stigma around mental health. And so people try to hide any kind of issues they have, and they tend to only confide in a very, very close friend or confidant. So that's the first thing. In terms of, I mean, some of the things that I did, one of the first things I found that really helped me was actually quit alcohol, because alcohol, I quit alcohol 5 years ago. And it was, in fact, we're approaching the day that I actually quit alcohol 5 years ago. And it was the day before my daughter's birthday, when she was 11, and she just turned 16. So that's why I can know.
You know when it is.
I know exactly, and it was on Saturday. It was my 5th year. But the thing is that a lot of people find it actually difficult to even contemplate quitting alcohol, because it's such a crutch in your life. And I had always kind of, my father, I mentioned, he had a young age, he had alcoholic problems and stuff like that, and it had this terrible effect on his health. And so I was always conscious of it, but I was never a difficult person in terms of alcohol and stuff. But what I did notice was that whenever I had a couple of drinks, I always felt like that this kind of feeling of depression or something like that would come back. And it's because it's a depressant, and for that reason, I wanted to eliminate it out of my life. And on top of that, for my fitness, alcohol was a big negative. Every time I had a couple of glasses of wine, the next morning, the training was never as good. And so I eliminated it completely from my life. And I actually, instead of feeling like that I'm suffering from having to kind of quit it, I actually completely embraced it. And I'm delighted that I don't drink alcohol. And I drink non-alcohol beer, good quality. I can have a few drinks with my friends. They don't feel like, the guy's not drinking, so it's not so much fun. I can just have a great time. And so that was one of the big things, that kind of realization. And that combined with fitness, then yes, in terms of the trappings and stuff like that, you can kind of think that, you are this guy with the big house, the big car and all this kind of stuff. And the reality is that your kids just see you as your dad, and they don't think of when they get to a certain age, maybe they start to enjoy the trappings. You can see a lot of these kind of stars that have kids that are a certain age, and they expect the big fancy lifestyle, celebrities and all this. And I think those guys are damaged goods. I think they will really suffer in a couple of years' time. And you can see often they end up in rehab and all sorts.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And really, I kind of think to myself that whole, if you do a kind of reflection on your life, and you project out. When I decided to end my marriage, my children were all still very young. And I can remember I spent about 2 years debating this idea of ending my marriage, because I was very unhappy. It wasn't working. We were arguing all the time. It was a terrible kind of strain from the financial situation and stuff. And my kids were so young. I was thinking, if I stay in the marriage for the sake of the kids, then the kids are going to witness their parents killing each other for the next 10 years. So I thought that was wrong. And then I thought also, if I stay with the kids and then they're teenagers and I'm leaving when they're teenagers, they might turn against me and stuff. And so I had all this kind of doubts about whether I should and stuff, but I decided to do it. And I can remember my kids, they just loved coming over to see me and all this. And they don't sort of say, Dad, why don't we live in the big mansion anymore? That just doesn't come into the children's mind, And it's, so if you're out there and if you're going through this stress and strain and you're thinking, how am I going to do it? It is challenging. There's no doubt. I lived in this, beautiful house, and suddenly you have to find the income to support 2 houses. And so you have to downsize. And so there's a certain amount of, eating humble pie, but you just have to embrace that. It's either you live in this kind of facade. This is one of the reasons I used Behind the Facade as my podcast name, because there's this facade that we all kind of live behind. And our true thoughts are one thing, but we put this persona on for everyone outside to see. And it's only when you decide that you're actually willing to break that pattern and, pattern interrupt, that you start to sort of say, okay, let's be the true authentic person that you are. And your kids will just love you anyway, no matter what, because you are being authentic, you're showing up for them, you're being, you're being the full parent that you should be. You're just not putting on a persona for the benefit of the outside world to see. And they don't notice any of that stuff anyway,
I think it's really interesting. I've had 2 or 3 clients who sort of, they've come to me and just sort of 2-3 weeks later, they've kind of come too late really. and they kind of ended up having a bit of a meltdown. You know, they ended up being signed off work, things like that. And I actually say to them, you know, by just being open and honest with not only the people around you, but with your kids, you're giving them a gift, really, because what you're saying is you don't have to be perfect, and we all go through these times. And actually, you know, let's try and spot these times earlier. And so I know with one of my kind of male clients in last year, he had the same thing happen, and I just said to him, talk to your kids about it. You know, they're all in late teens. Talk to them about how you feel. Talk to them about kind of where you should have taken action, and talk about, you know, how it is that you now have. And I think, you know, just touching on your earlier point about therapy, you know, I would say a lot of the work that I do is therapeutic. I'm a therapist as well. But men will always book in for coaching, and it's only when they come into the room, they come in, I want to have some coaching, and then it's only when I sit here and say, okay, but actually, you know, you've got, you know, your father's still influencing you, or you're still doing, you know, you're not living to being who you actually want to be. Can we do the therapy work and then do the coaching? And they'll kind of go, oh yeah, okay. And then afterwards they're like, oh my God, you know, that was so much more impactful than any coaching I've ever had. But it's a really difficult thing, because in some respects I can't just say, oh, I'm a therapist, because people wouldn't come.
Yeah, and I'm sure when they're talking to their mates, they're not saying I'm seeing a therapist.
No,
I'm seeing a coach.
I'm a coach.
You know?
And it's interesting. I know, you know, in prison, what they realized was that people in prison wouldn't see therapists. Men in prison were not going to see therapists, but they would see coaches. So actually they sent therapists in under the guise of a coach. And so, you know, for me, that's kind of why I love my skill set, because, you know, I absolutely am a coach, and I can coach. But for me, you know, all coaching, actually, if you go in and kind of use the housing, you know, the architect and the housing metaphor is, you know, for me, it's going in under the foundations, putting in your engineering bricks, actually do your foundations, because a coach will come in and they'll help you paint and they'll help you decorate and put your furniture in certain places. But if you're floating on ice, and that's kind of what you're talking about, actually, your beautiful house was floating on ice, really, and you put your foundations in. So it's about us looking, isn't it, at our not only our kind of financial skill set, but our mental skill set of how do you get your mental foundations in so that you're building on something rather than, you know.
Well, it all starts at a young age. And I mean, you really do need to have that kind of grounding. And one of the reasons you know, the podcast, and I'm starting to kind of mentor people now. And I have a small group of young men that kind of have asked. It's funny, there's actually no women yet that have asked for this mentorship, but it's open to everyone. And so I've been kind of mentoring them. And the journey I've been explaining is that, you know, guys, don't fall into that, you know, comparable lifestyle where you're constantly trying to compare yourself with other people. And one of the funny things that it's funny, I recall something that that stands out. Like if you're in that comparison lifestyle where you're constantly, it's like this hole that you constantly have to keep feeding money into. And it's like, I've got to get the new car, oh, I got to go and buy the new watch, and I got to do this. And you're constantly looking for something to kind of keep up with the other guy. And the guys then equally do it, and then you have to try to improve upon that, and it's got to be the next fancy holiday, and it's this, and it's just this like never ending, you know, roundabout that you're on. Whereas if you embrace the opposite, and if you actually think of yourself as this kind of eccentric person who does the opposite. And so there was a funny thing I remember, you know, there was this MTV Cribs years ago, and it was this show on MTV where guys like, you know, football stars and, you know, this pop stars would show their amazing mansions, and you'd have basketball guys say, come on in, and it would be like a 15-bedroom mansion, and there'd be Bentleys and, you know, Lamborghinis all parked out the front. And then there was this Hollywood star, I can't remember his name, but he was such a breath of fresh air. He said, yeah, come on into my place. And he said, you know, check out the Fiat over there. It's running on 14-inch rims and all this. And it was just this like completely ordinary car. And he goes, yeah, I like the orange paintwork. I think it's got a nice kind of got that specially done, you know. And then he watch into the house, and he goes, so here's my, you know, 1-bedroom apartment, and, you know, over here I've got the refrigerator, and and it was so refreshing. That's
brilliant.
And the guy was like a kind of one of these celebrity A-listers, but he just was not getting caught up in all that bullshit. And it was such a refresh. I remember thinking to myself, that is so refreshing. And I mean, he's not somebody that is worrying about, you know, have I got, and he's probably got a massive war chest of cash that just keeps building up because he doesn't have to play this game.
He's not spending it. You remind me of a story I was told by a friend ages ago, and he was saying he went to see a friend of his, and her parents were incredibly well off, and her parents were away, and he said he got to the house and she'd effectively kind of was nesting in this huge kitchen, sort of dining living room, and he said, there was this enormous, like 8-9 bedrooms at the rest of the house, and she was like, oh, it's just a bit kind of creepy being here on my own, like, it's just weird. So she'd kind of almost just made this like flat in the kitchen and just didn't like the rest of it. And I think I often see that, if there's lots of you, I mean, there's been, I have 5 children, there's a lot of us, but there's a point where you all have enough space, that's enough. It's fine.
It's
but
enough.
Like you say, it's people kind of going, oh, because I'm this. And I remember turning 40. I'm 47 now, but I remember turning 40 and I can't remember what I was going to do. I think I was going to go clubbing or something. And a friend went, you can't go clubbing, you're 40. And I just went, who's talking about?
Yeah.
Who says that? And it is this sort of mentality, isn't it? That you do this in this situation, or you do this because you're this age. And actually it's about us going, well, I want to choose who I am, and who I am is more important than kind of what I have. Once you've got your kind of food, shelter, love, you're all good to go. But Gavin, we've been talking for ages, and I've got some key questions that every guest that I want to bring you back to. So, thinking about going through those kind of times of huge challenge and resilience that you've been through, sort of a light-hearted, but was there a kind of a book, a film, or a movie, or all three? Anything that really resonates from that time that helped?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of movies that I've always, I have all three to give you your answer. First of all, my favorite movie is also this amazing story about, patience and discipline and biding your time. And that is, of course, The Shawshank Redemption.
Oh,
and that is
yes.
I just think it's the best movie ever made. I just absolutely adore that. Since the moment I saw it in the cinema and I wasn't prepared for the twist. And I remember just like, what's happening? And it's just, for anyone who hasn't seen the movie, I don't want to spoil it, but it is just the most amazing movie. And that just, the moral of the story and the whole thing is just so beautiful. So that is definitely up there. There's also another movie that came out then more recently. It's still a few years back now, but Will Smith played this, it's a true story called The Pursuit of Happiness.
Yeah.
And it's a true story of a guy that decided to turn his life around and become basically a stockbroker. And he actually ended up homeless and living in public toilets in a subway station with his son. And it's just the most incredible story of resilience. And those two stories both gave me in this sense of, you know what, I'm going to be one of those resilient people. I'm going to be the person who comes out of this and I'll have this amazing story to tell, rather than closing the book and saying, right, that is my script is finished and I'm done for now. You just basically have to kind of say, you know what, this is only a chapter. I'm going to go and keep writing this book. And that's kind of my view. In terms of a book that I've really enjoyed, I read quite a lot, and there's obvious books like, Tim Ferriss wrote a great 4-Hour Work Week, and a lot of these books were influential on me. But one that really stood out in the last couple of years it's a book called The Code of the Extraordinary Mind by a guy called Vishen Lakhiani. And it's an unusual name for a book. It's actually, I found it very, very powerful, and I really took an awful lot of good out of that book. And so I just think he's quite a successful guy himself, but he talks about his moments of difficulty. And he was actually living in the US and he got deported because his visa ran out or something, and he couldn't get back into the country. And he had a whole business in the country, and he couldn't get back into the country to actually run his business. So very challenging story, and interesting guy. And then just in terms of music, around the time all of this stuff was going on, was Coldplay came out with that song Fix You. And it resonates with me particularly, just because of the lyrics and all that. It's just so that stands out in my mind immediately as music that kind of I remember during this difficult time that kind of propped me back up.
Oh, that's brilliant. Absolutely love those selections. And I haven't read that book, so I'll go off and get it. But I totally agree. The Shawshank Redemption and Pursuit of Happiness, beautiful films. Yeah. So my second question is to you, what is your kind of, I know you've got so many lessons and absolutely, tell everyone to tune into your podcast, but if there was something people could do today, either a mindset issue or an action that they could take that literally today is going to make a difference, what would it be?
Well, I suppose I take you back to that kind of statement I made around the decisions that you make today can have this profound impact on you 4 or 5 years from now. And a lot of people, this whole delayed gratification or premature gratification, as I call it, is everyone wants the payday today. They don't want to put it off. And the reality is, I mean, if you are finding that you're out there spending money and you're kind of trying to keep up with this presumed kind of image that you're supposed to have, just try to knock that on the head and just realize that this is a marathon, not a sprint. Life, we've got, I'm the very, very same age as yourself. And so I kind of think to myself, I don't think that I've got another 20 years and then I'm going to retire. I think to myself, I've got 40, 50, 60 years. And I'm really, and also with technology and things like that and innovation, I actually think we're going to start seeing people living into their kind of mid hundreds and stuff. I think it's actually, it's on the cards. Do you have a nest egg that is going to sustain you into your 80s and 90s and things like that? Most people have nothing like that at all. And you can have that lifestyle today that you want, but the reality is that you will live the remaining, say, 30 years of your life in terrible kind of poverty, because you won't have the energy to work and to do all of the kind of stuff that brings in the income. And I see I have my own mother, like she's a wealthy lady, and yet she has this real, I suppose, this scarcity mindset, and she lives a very, very frugal lifestyle because she's worried about spending money. And I think it's a hang up from the experience with my dad and things like that. But like, she doesn't turn on the heat in the house, and she has jumpers on all the time and stuff, like, to keep warm, because she doesn't want to waste the money. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, is that how I am going to be in 25 years time? And it's possibly the way we'll all end up if we're not careful and get control of our your immediate emotions and this need to satisfy instant gratification. You got to get on control of that. I think that is probably the biggest lesson that I would have in that regard.
I think that's an absolutely brilliant one. And I was sort of reminded of the phrase, look after the pennies and the pounds to look after themselves. And I think, I was saying earlier, I've kind of not had a lot of money most of my life. And I remember as a single mum in my 20s with kind of 3 kids under the age of 6, looking at a letter and thinking, first class stamp or second class stamp, just literally making that judgment. And I know, sort of, a few years ago, I was sort of with my partner, and we suddenly got to this point where we had enough money to, not buy anything, but to kind of buy with the things we wanted. And I suddenly thought, gosh, I'm now, not picking up things for free that I would have done on the kind of free cycle things. And I'm, it was a very different me, which has always been this kind of very money saving, I'll sell this even if it's a fiver, and, that sort of thing. And I have to, my 2 youngest children are, my 16-year-old is so financially astute. She'll go to the supermarket and it's kind of, I come back with this because, you get 2 of them for this price and this works out better. And I worked out the cost effective. My son is like, money runs through his fingers like water. And what I see is a difference in maths ability. So she's dyslexic and her maths ability is extremely high. And he really, really struggles with maths. So figures just mean nothing to him. And his biggest lesson, kind of early lesson, was that my ex-partner linked my son's debit card, which, I'd got him because I wanted him to be financially astute, to his game profile.
Oh.
Suddenly he said to me, where's my £200, mum? And he'd gone through it buying, skins in some game. And I just had
Fortnite,
to sit, Fortnite, good old Fortnite. And actually that was a huge lesson. Well, can I get it back? No, it's not.
You've blown it. Yeah.
Pounds gone. Really, really big lesson, which in some respects I was kind of glad he learned at, 12 rather than, 32. But no, I think that's a fantastic piece of advice, is, think about, and in fact, when I was listening to you on another podcast and you picked up that phrase, it really stuck with me. And even sort of, I think I'm quite good at money. It made me go, okay, yeah, hang on, let me just pause and double check, what's the 5-year plan? So I think it's brilliant. So my last and kind of final question to you is, if you were standing in front of the kind of world leaders of today, what would your message be to them?
Okay, well, it kind of goes off the kind of backstory, but I've become quite cognizant of sustainability and the environment and things like that. And one thing that I think is going to, we're talking about instant gratification, is that as COVID-19 has taught us, Bill Gates 5 years ago warned us about this. And if there's also there's a good thing of Barack Obama speaking about a couple of years from now, a decade from now, there may be this airborne respiratory disease or influenza or whatever. So it was there. Everyone knew that these risks existed, and it was ignored. And today we're paying the pandemic, the price. And if you actually just think about the amount of scientists that have warned us about global warming, climate change, the melting of the glaciers, it's all happening right in front of our eyes, and none of us are paying any attention to it. And I think that the same thing is going to happen unless we pay attention, is that there's going to be this point of no return when the damage is irreversible. And then everyone's going to suddenly be saying, "Oh, we have to do this." And look at what we're spending today on the pandemic. Look at the billions that the governments are throwing at trying to keep the economy going, and this is only a tip of the iceberg compared to what global warming and climate change. I mean, if you have sea levels rising kind of 10 meters in the next 50 years, that's half of the cities around the world are going to have to be relocated. Imagine the billions that's going to cost. So I would say to them is pay attention to the environment and to this climate change issue, because it's kind of the delayed gratification thing again. It's politically, it's not popular to do anything about it today. You're not going to get any votes for it today, but in 20 years time, 30 years time, after your political career is finished, there's going to be a huge price that the world pays. And I just think that people are just not focused on that.
I totally agree, and I think it's a really lovely point, and it reminds me of a quote I saw by one of the astronauts. And he said he thought that all world leaders should have to go to space, because in space you can't see the boundaries, you can't see the walls, and you just see that actually this is a singular planet, in the middle of the kind of vast nothingness. Look after it, because it's your home.
It's so true. Yeah, it's so true.
I think that's a beautiful point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Gavin, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate your candidness and your sort of transparency with your journey. There's so many lessons in everything that you said, and like I say, I fully recommend people to get hold of you on your podcast. If they aren't people who listen to podcasts, where else can they find you?
Well, I go by Gavin J. Gallagher in all my social media kind of stuff. So I'm on LinkedIn, I'm in Facebook, and I'm in various places. I would just make sure you put the J in there, because apparently there's 100 Gavin Gallaghers in the world. So J is important. And then I'm probably going to be releasing a book that kind of backs up the whole Behind the Facade podcast. And it's going to be a combination of all the lessons and things like that. So look out for that, and you'll find it. I have a website, gavinjgallagher.com, where you can learn more.
Brilliant. Gavin, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Not at all, Mary. Pleasure.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Mary Williams, as you know, and thank you so much for listening to the Alternative Leader podcast. I search for guests to bring you lessons and learnings that can help move you forward in your life, help you achieve the success that you want to, in whatever way that shows up for you, to help you lead powerfully, whether that's in your own life, as your parenting, your personal, or your professional, and make you the best that you can be. If you've enjoyed the show, please rate and review it, and please share it with as many people as you think also want to move forward and gain success in their lives. If you want to find out more about me, go over to my website, which is www.mary-williams.com. That's www.mary, which is MARI-williams.com, and you'll find links to all of my social media profiles there. There's also a Facebook community that you can join, and again, all the links will be on the website too. I hope you have an absolutely fantastic day, and thank you so much for listening.